All right, Bashan, you're good.
All right. Hello. Welcome, everyone, to Politics and Prose Live. My name is Bashan Horsley. I'm part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Before we get started, just a couple quick items. Just want to let everyone know that at any point during this event, you can go into the chat section to click on a link to purchase President's Populism and the Crisis of Democracy. It'll take you directly to the Politics and Prose website. Also, if anyone has a question, we ask that you direct it to the Q&A box, which is next to chat on the bottom, and then we'll be able to facilitate questions from there for the question and answer section. Now that that's out of the way, let me welcome William Howell and Terry Moe to PNP Live. William Howell is the Sydney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago, Director of the Center for Effective Government, and co-host of Not Another Politics podcast. Terry Moe is the William Bennett Munro Professor of Political Science at Stanford University and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. They are both members of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and winners of the Legacy Award for a work of enduring significance to the study of the American presidency. They are joined in conversation today by Thomas Edsall, a New York Times contributing op-ed writer who covers American politics, inequality, campaign strategy, and demographics. So gentlemen, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Well, Tom, you want me to just take it away for a few minutes?
Sure.
All right. So William and I want to thank all of you for tuning in. And we want to say that we're really honored that Tom has agreed to moderate this session. We really look forward to it. My job here at the beginning is just to spend a minute or two acquainting everyone with the basic themes and content of our book. At the heart of it is the unfortunate reality that the United States over the last several years has been plunged into a historic crisis of democracy that threatens to bring down our longstanding system of self-government. The purpose of our book is to understand why this crisis has come about and what we can do about it. Now, the most immediate cause of this crisis is Donald Trump. During his presidency, he has undermined the rule of law. He's abused the powers of the presidency, and he's attacked our democratic institutions. But he's best not thought of as the main cause of the crisis. He's better thought of as a symptom of these incredibly powerful worldwide socioeconomic forces of globalization, of technological change, of immigration, the forces of modernity, really, that have caused economic pain and cultural anxiety for millions of Americans. Now, these are very real and serious problems, and our government has done an entirely ineffective job of dealing with them. The result of that has been the rise of populist anger directed against a system that doesn't work, and support for a populist strongman who will take on the system and get things done. Democracy be damned. So these are the conditions that Donald Trump took advantage of in getting elected in 2016. And these are the conditions that have profoundly shaped and fueled his populist, anti-democratic presidency. So here's the bigger problem. The bigger problem is when Trump goes away, let's say he loses the election, these conditions are still going to be there. Globalization is not going to go away. Technological change is not going to go away. And what we're going to see is the continuation of populist anger and the continuation of these conditions that other populists down the road will take advantage of, just as Trump has. And so for the defenders of democracy, the challenge is to build an effective government, a government that can deal with the problems of modern times. But to do that, we need to adopt institutional reforms that give our government the capacity for effectiveness, which it doesn't now have. So the last part of our book is about what kinds of reforms we think are likely to promote effective government. And that is what William is going to talk about now. So I'll turn it over to him.
Sure. Let me just say a few words. And yeah, what a pleasure to be with all of you, and an honor to be in conversation with Tom this evening. Terry has sort of outlined both our diagnosis of where we are in this moment and what the stakes are involved in this upcoming election, and the challenges that we as a country face. And he turns towards, as we turn towards, the need for institutional reform in the service of a more effective government. And our attention there turns towards the presidency itself, because first, the presidency most directly is the kind of channel of this populist sentiment and can represent the most direct threat to democracy on the one hand. And on the other hand, just as importantly, vitally, can serve as a channel through which we can recover a more effective government. And so what we do in the last chapter of the book is sort of lay out a set of reforms that we think, one, will check against the threat that presidencies face when the presidency faces when it's in the hands of a demagogue, but on the other hand, leverages the promise of presidential leadership and the possibility that we'll have somebody who can articulate national long-term considerations in our politics so that we can more effectively attend to the very real, very large, complicated challenges of modernity. And very briefly, we can go into these in greater detail, but very briefly, on one side of the ledger is the effort to try to leverage the promise of presidential leadership. And we do what we offer recommendations that have to do with enhancing the president's agenda setting power within Congress and thereby enlivening the legislative process. But we also recognize that just giving the presidency more power is not the ticket. There are important checks and limits that need to be placed on the presidency. And there are certain powers that presidents have now which are not in the service of a more effective government, like the ability to politicize the administrative state, like the ability to interfere with the Justice Department. And there are other kinds of powers having to do with unilateral powers that need to be checked in important respects. And we offer kind of a diagnosis of what those powers are and what can productively be done. But we don't end the book on a note that just says, hi, right? Once we just do these things, we're all set and we're all in the clear. I think we take a pretty clear-eyed view of the profound challenges that stand before us, both in the work that lies ahead and then the impediments to making progress on this. And those have to do, in part, with the challenges associated with amending the Constitution. They also have to do with the challenges associated with changes in the Republican Party, which we can talk about. So, I mean, this is a pretty sober book. When we end on a pretty sober note that, look, the challenges are profound, but the stakes are astronomical. And what we need to do is begin to gather ourselves and see past Trump to the kinds of institutional reforms generally that we need to make in the service of a more effective government. And more specifically, how we can constitute a presidency for modern time that will deliver that more effective government. So let me sort of stop there and then turn it over to Tom, and we can try to unpackage this a little bit together as a group.
Thanks very much for both of you. That was very well done. Let me say at the beginning, I am not sure that I agree with your basic premise, which, as I see it, is that right now the major frustration angering people is that the government cannot act, and as they face increasingly problematic situations in their work life and home life and so forth, they become angry with government, and that lends itself to a populist appeal of the kind that Trump has made, that he comes in and says, I can be a strong man. I just wonder if, in fact, the problems of governing, the inability to reach any conclusion, grow out of the changed agenda that has occurred really since the mid-1960s, where we used to, before that, mostly we faced economic choices where you could make deals and you could say, okay, the left gets this, the right gets that, and sort of cut the pie right down the middle. We now have issues that do not lend themselves to compromise. The most obvious of that is abortion, but the same is true with gay marriage, all the culture war issues, the role of women in the household. All of these are very fraught, difficult issues that are inherently much tougher to negotiate. And I'm not sure that simply institutionally granting the president more power and you have an interesting proposal to basically give him the power to introduce legislation and appointments under a fast track system, whether that is going to really resolve the situation and address the real problem of populism threatening the continued governance under democratic principles. Let me throw it out there.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here, right? There's a lot in play. So where to start? I think one place to start is that, I mean, a core part of this book is recognizing this linkage that's true, not just here, but is true where populism arises around the globe between government failure, that is widespread corruption sometimes. Sometimes it's an inability to attend to, in a way, the challenges of globalization, where you have communities that are hurt, and they're and the harm and the anxiety that they feel is not adequately attended to, and big immigration flows. That these kinds of things, left unattended, lead to a kind of anger and disaffection and frustration, which is what we see over the last half century, which are, I mean, look, those are profoundly complex issues. They too are hard, but they're things that the government could have done something about. And so what you see is that in the late 60s, early 70s, widespread kind of support for the government that plummets over the last 50 years as these challenges come before the country. And this is precisely what Trump runs on, right? What he runs on is a claim that immigration is broken, and it's broken because the system is rigged. And he taps into that anger and disaffection, just as populists regularly do. They come in and they say the whole system is illegitimate. It has failed you because it doesn't care about you. And I, as the outsider, stand apart from this wreckage, and I promise to deliver, right? I promise to deliver a solution that the system has failed to do so. And so in that sense, I don't think there's much evidence, frankly, that that populism emerges because of a shift in the agenda, so much it is in the aftermath, and it's what we lay out in some detail in the book, in the aftermath of extended periods of government failure to address concerns and an appetite that the larger public has for some kind of action. One last word, and then I'll let Terry, you should jump in here, which is,
Yeah, I will.
yeah, I know, there's so much in play, that it is that sense that they could have done something and that they didn't, that sets in motion this first disaffection, but then also anger, which then can be racialized, which then can be taken into really ugly places. But it's born of, we want to argue, in important respects, government failure.
Okay, so I'll say a few words. Populism is very real. It's a powerful force, not just in the United States, but throughout the Western world. It's also powerful in Latin America, but it has been for a long time. It's a newly powerful phenomenon in the United States and in Western Europe. Trump is an outlier among all presidents we've ever had, right? So this is not just some sort of version of polarization. It's not some version of a different kind of agenda, right? Populism is pretty much the same everywhere, right? And it has to do with an anger against the system, which happens to be a democratic system. It has to do with leaders who are fueling division and hatred and fear of the other, demonization of racial groups, and fear of cultural marginalization, right? It's about white Christians in this country feeling that they're losing their country, their predominance to minorities. All of this is being stirred up by Trump. It is what populists do everywhere, right? And this is not the kind of thing that was typical of our politics in the 70s or 80s or 90s. Trump is a so-called conservative, but he has very little in common with Ronald Reagan and Reagan's presidency. This is a different kind of a thing.
How then would granting the president the power to fast track legislation and appointments, how would that alleviate these conflicts when they are really built into the system? If the president comes up with a proposal to deal with immigration, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. If he comes up with a proposal to deal with inequality, and I should say if she comes up also, I don't see exactly how having this increased power will clear the air and make for a healthy, equitable solution, as opposed to simply enhancing the power of the president to set an agenda.
Look, what we have is a political system that just doesn't work. We have a legislative process that doesn't work. You know, we've had an immigration problem for decades. Why hasn't Congress acted on it? There have been proposals, a couple of proposals by George W. Bush that had bipartisan support in Congress. They went down on filibusters, right? They never even really came to a vote. It was the filibuster that took them down. And then in 2013, Obama made a proposal that had bipartisan support. John Boehner wouldn't bring it up for a vote. It's because the congressional decision process is a pathological process that doesn't allow comprehensive, coherent, intellectually well-justified proposals to pass and to actually deal with these problems. And what we're suggesting is not that the president be all powerful, for God's sake, but that we change the structure of the legislative process to streamline it so that the president can make proposals to Congress that Congress can't change and that they have to vote on up or down within a certain period of time. And that allows the president to actually design these packages as Bush and Obama did. Congress has to act on it. And that would ensure that we have a process in which something actually happens. Now, Congress can vote it down, right? But it can't sit on it. It can't just shelve these things. It has to take action. Legislators have to go on the record as being either for or against. Right now, we have a process that's just stuck in the mud, and these issues just fester. They don't ever get addressed or solved. This is a system that doesn't work, and we need reform to the legislative process, and the president is the key to the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, if I could throw in a couple things. I mean, these are important themes for we don't just sort of pivot right to here's our favorite kind of grab bag of institutional reforms. They're born of our effort to take stock of what goes on within Congress as an institution as designed, and what kind of leadership presidents stand to offer, and how that distinguishes itself from what goes on within Congress. And so we walk through in some detail about the kind of national, longer term considerations that animate presidential leadership, not by us kind of referencing our favorite president or looking at presidents as kind of the people who will, by virtue of their humanity, will deliver us, but because of where they sit in government and who they're held responsible for, too. And so, but we also recognize that presidents represent a threat. So it's not in two ways, right? It's a recognition that we want to enliven a legislative process, which is not working. We get some mix of gridlock or these unbelievably complex omnibus legislation that's filled with carve-outs and exceptions handed out for every imaginable organized interest on the one hand, or we get gridlock. And that what we need to do is build a process that leverages the kind of leadership that presidents stand to offer, while also recognizing that presidents can represent a very real threat, and that then some powers that they have actually have the effect of undermining effective government, right? We're not cheering for presidents for the sake of, because we're sort of partisan president, we're sort of partisans of that one branch. It's because what we want to do is build a more effective government, one that's capable of solving problems. And so we spend a lot of time then walking through powers that we would just assume check or take away from the president as a part of a larger initiative, again, to reimagine the presidency in the service of more effective government.
Let me just add one thing to clarify this, and we can move on. Presidents historically have been the champions of effective government. And the reason they are is that uniquely, of all these players, presidents care about their legacies. And their legacies are determined by how successful they are at crafting and adopting solutions to the nation's most serious problems. That is not true of members of Congress. Plus, there are 535 of them. They're from different states, they're from different localities. They have no responsibility for whether these problems ever get solved. Their decision process is just a godforsaken mess. And so by shifting agenda control in the president's direction, what we're doing is putting more control in the hands of the one player that actually cares about effective government and can do something about it. Congress would still get to vote in the end, up or down, right? But if you let Congress design policies as we do now, what they do is they cobble together some sort of mishmash that can get past Congress, maybe, but these things don't actually solve problems. That is the essence of the difficulty that we face. Members of Congress are not held responsible for solving the nation's problems, and historically they haven't. So we need to do something about that. This was a system that was designed in 1787 for 4 million farmers. It's a government that was never intended to deal with the problems of modern times. Well, these are very modern times with vexing problems, and we need a government that is capable of solving them. Right now, we don't have that. And we need to shift toward a system that can solve it, and having a president who is a champion of effective government is a real plus.
You make good points, and I still hesitant about what you're suggesting, but one of the things you also seem to do is to empower the bureaucracy. You limit the number of political appointees that the president could make, and you try to insulate as much as possible many of the key executive branch agencies, especially the intelligence and law enforcement and foreign policy entities that are in government. And if the president is going to initiate policy that is comprehensive and detailed, he is going to in turn become more dependent on the bureaucracy to produce all the details of a bill that would be required. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it does seem as if you are empowering the deep state in effect, as opposed to Congress, that you're shifting power from one part of government to another part. And it may be a good thing to do that, it may not, but it seems to me that there's the potential for all kinds of unanticipated consequences. They could be good, they could be bad, but it's an interesting shift. I don't know whether you thought about this.
Yeah, so I don't think we're taking any of the tools that are available to Congress right now to oversee the bureaucracy. We're not taking any of them away. What we're doing, what we'd like to do, is reduce first the president's ability to politicize the administrative state, and then his, someday her, ability to meddle in the affairs of the Justice Department and the intelligence community. And there are two animating concerns here. The first is that political scientists have shown a clear trade-off between one's ability to politicize and ensure loyalty on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ability to acquire and nurture the acquisition of expertise. And expertise is the stuff of good government. What we want is an independent bureaucracy, a strong, robust bureaucracy, because that too is a contributor to a more effective government. And that if we had, we would like to argue, a more effective, more independent administrative state, the nation's ability to meet, for instance, the threat of this pandemic would be a good deal more effective. So that's one concern. And then the other one, so it's about effective government. There also is, again, this threat that presidents can represent when a demagogue of the sort that Trump is, we believe, occupies the office and then grabs a hold of the Justice Department in order to prosecute his enemies and in order to ensure that the rule of law is not upheld and that he's held kind of to exception, is not held accountable for his own misdeeds. And so these two concerns, one, the threat that presidents can represent, and two, recognizing that other people are contributors to effective government, and the politicization of the administrative state undermines that, are reasons why we think that those powers should be limited, checked, or taken away from the president.
Yeah, so I agree with all that. Let me just add a few points. Look, I think if we're going to have an effective government, we need a government that is professional and expert, right? That can take advantage of those resources in implementing public policy. Politicization undermines professionalism and expertise. Look at what Trump has done. He has filled the bureaucracy with political lackeys. In many cases, these people have no expertise, and yet there they are in these agencies wreaking havoc, right? This is the kind of thing that happens when a president, any president, can make 3,500 different appointments throughout the executive branch. Now, in the past, presidents have been pretty responsible in the way they've handled it. Not Trump, right? He has taken this to an extreme, and he has gone a long way toward destroying the professionalism of the bureaucracy. You know, the fact is there is no deep state, right? All advanced nations have an administrative state, right, that is responsible for administering public policy. In any democratic government, 98% of the government is administrative. It is the administrative state. We need to have an administrative state, and it needs to be professional. If you look at Britain or any of the European countries, their entire bureaucracy is basically made up of careerists, right? People who are experts in their field. They're not political appointees. They have very few political appointees. And what we're saying is the United States should do that. It makes perfect sense to do that. So that's that point. The point about independence, and William brought this up about the Justice Department and the intelligence agencies. Look what's happening. You know, Trump is basically saying, I can control everything that the Justice Department does. If they take up any investigation that I don't like, including investigations into me or my cronies, I can shut those investigations down. I can fire prosecutors. I can do whatever I want. I can fill the intelligence agencies with my own appointees who are loyal to me, and they will use those agencies in any way that I want them to. This is not acceptable in a democracy, where we need to have those agencies be independent of presidential control. This is really fundamental if our democracy is going to be able to survive. And so both these pillars, professionalism and depoliticization on the one hand, and independence of the Justice Department and the intelligence agencies, are critical to the kinds of reforms that we think need to be carried out for a more effective government.
Why don't you have some provision for Congress acting in some ways as a check on the government, the abuse of government? For example, that this current Congress has had great difficulty obtaining testimony from the administration, often in cases where that fit your description of an apparent abuse of power taking place. But you don't address Congress particularly, as far as I can tell, except to diminish its powers.
So our focal point is on the presidency because we see reconstituting the presidency for modern times is vital in our effort to build a more effective government. I guess I would say that look, there's work to be done all over the place. I mean, we need to get clarity about the subpoena powers that are available to Congress and to shore those up, and that can sit alongside the class of reforms that we're talking about. But what we want to do is recognize the kind of, look, the presidency is the linchpin here in terms of recovering a more effective government. And until we set to work on reconstituting it, that yes, there are things that can be done in Congress. There are a variety of things. We could build larger staffs. We could increase the kind of information that's available to legislators in evaluating policy, and those would all be good things. And there have been plenty of people who talk about those kinds of ways to kind of resuscitate Congress. And I think there's widespread recognition that Congress, well, is something of a disaster, and that these are things that might play to Congress's advantage. I think when we talk about the agenda setting power that we want to give to the president, that's in no small part trying to enliven the legislative process, to say, look, legislators, you can no longer find kind of little comfort by hiding under the wings of the majority party leader who's going to protect you from casting hard votes. It's that, no, you have to debate these things. You have to take them on. You can shoot them down if you want to. But in that sense, it's not so much, to our minds, like limiting them or undermining them as it is calling them out and developing a mechanism that's going to force them to take action and to engage in hard debate about complex issues that thus far they've shown largely unwilling to engage in. And so, we're not dismantling Congress. If anything, when you look at the class of reforms that we're putting forward to, we're scaling back a whole bunch of powers that presidents have. And in this one domain, we want to include presidents among the agenda setters. Congress still can carry on and pass laws as they so choose. It's not to say that the only agenda setter is the president. They can shoot something down that the president recommends and introduce something on their own that they would prefer to see. That's fair play. But we want to, again, leverage the kind of perspective and the kind of leadership that comes from the presidency, again, in the service of a more effective government.
Let me just make a couple of points here too. Look, you talked about the potential that Congress may have to check the presidency. I think that's absolutely crucial if this system is going to work. But there are at least two problems that get in the way. One is political. What happens if Donald Trump goes off the rails, as he has, and the Democratic House tries to check him and the Republican Senate won't do anything? What if the House wants to impeach him and the Republican Senate won't do anything? Okay, nothing happens. That's a political problem. Why is it a problem? Because the Republicans won't do anything. Because the Republicans won't allow Congress to do what Congress has the power to do. So in the end, for this reason and for many other reasons, the Republican Party has turned out to be an anti-democratic party. It's a party that now is the organizational vehicle for populism. And it's a party that is perfectly willing to behave in an undemocratic way, to circle the wagons around a president that behaves in an undemocratic way, simply in order to protect their own, to protect their power, to protect their party. Right? This is very dangerous, but it's happening. Okay, that is one part of this. The other part of it, which we also talk about in the book, is the theory of the unitary executive. And this again is a conservative thing. There are many conservative scholars, especially in the Federalist Society, that believe in the theory of the unitary executive. And what that theory essentially says is, listen to William Barr, right? What it says is the president can do anything he wants in the executive branch. If he wants to fire Mueller, fine. If he wants to end investigations, fine. He can do anything he wants. He can control anybody in the executive branch, hire anybody, fire anybody. Independent commissions really should be unconstitutional. There doesn't need to be a civil service. Unconstitutional, restricts president's power, and so on. lots of people, I would say the great majority of constitutional scholars don't agree with the theory of the unitary executive and think it's fantasy. But there are a number of conservative scholars who do, and people on the Supreme Court that share this view. William Barr believes in the theory of the unitary executive. This theory, I think, is a fantasy, is unfounded, but it's also very, very dangerous. And it prevents Congress from checking the president, because what happens when the president says, or when Congress says, okay, we want you to submit certain documents or have certain people testify, the president just says, no, I control the executive branch. I won't let anybody do anything. And William Barr backs him up. The president can do anything he wants. That knocks the legs out from under Congress's ability to check the executive branch. So what has to happen here, if this situation is going to be turned around, is that the theory of the unitary executive has to be debunked finally and overturned and not allowed to become law. Because if it becomes law, you know, it empowers an authoritarian president.
In your proposal, where the administration basically introduces legislation that then goes on a fast track up or down vote only system, what is the public input to the formulation of the legislation itself, and what role will lobbyists play in this process?
Well, all we're doing is, again, introducing a new agenda setter, right? And so the president is elected by the people, just as legislators are elected by the people. And then there will be a certain period of time under which they have to cast a vote. And in the introduction of law, presumably that will then jumpstart a much more kind of vibrant debate, because they have to cast an opinion. They have to cast a vote on precisely that which the president introduces. Now, look,
I'm asking in the part where the president actually puts together the bill that addresses, for example, the globalization consequences on unemployment. Huge bill involving whatever it includes. As he or she develops that bill, is there a public process for the public to have input, for lobbyists to have input? Or is that done entirely by the executive branch? I raise this in part because, if you recall, Hillary Clinton put together the Bill Clinton healthcare package really behind closed doors in many respects, in a relatively non-public process. And it gave critics of the proposal a strong opening basically to kill it and say that it was devised in secrecy, in effect. What would you have as a procedure at that basic stage, especially since this is unchangeable legislation? It is not subject to amendment in the legislative process, so that the actual formulation is critical. I'm just wondering what role, what kind of transparency would there be? What kind of citizen input? What kind of lobbyist input would there be?
So presidents who simply get behind closed doors and mark up a bill without any eye towards the larger public and without any eye towards what legislators will be willing to put up with are likely to produce things that aren't going to pass. And so they have real incentives to reach out and engage in a larger public discussion. I mean, Hillary Clinton's healthcare legislation dies for precisely the reasons that you note. I'll say though, I mean, so on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, look, part of the reason why presidential leadership is different is that presidents aren't subject to the kind of lobbying and influence of organized interests that Congress is by virtue of its institutional design. There's a long history of fast track authority in trade policy that was given to the president precisely because legislators were concerned that if they were charged with figuring out what trade policy ought to look like, and they were allowed to amend whatever trade policy was negotiated, that there would be all of these organized interests descending upon the legislation. And what you would end up with is, again, an incoherent mess. And we wouldn't be able to liberalize international trade policy. And by giving the president this authority to say, here's a bill, now vote on it, you would be able to produce more coherent international trade policy. And that's basically what we've gotten. And so I think it cuts both ways. On the one hand, presidents already have incentives, if they had this power, to engage in a larger public discussion and to anticipate the kinds of objections that would be levied against whatever it is that they put forward, and either argue against them or accommodate them, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's precisely because they aren't subject to the kind of intense lobbying that legislators are, that they offer a different kind of leadership that we want to leverage, that we want to, and that's the whole point of giving them this agenda setting authority, is because it will force legislators to, I mean, the idea that legislators are going to provide the kind of leadership that we need in order to deal with something like climate change is when all that they're going to be thinking about at each turn is, how is this going to offend some organized interest back home? This is not to say that every president is going to step forward with the right solution or be willing to step forward with any solution. But our best shot at attending to that issue is through presidential leadership. And it's because they are, because they care about legacy, they're going to be thinking more about the whole. They'll be thinking about longer term consequences, and that we want to productively leverage that.
You know, a natural occurrence, I think, if the president were thinking of proposing legislation on climate change or whatever, is that congressional committees would hold hearings. Right? There would be public hearings in both the House and the Senate. It's just that they wouldn't be crafting the legislation, the president would. But the president and his people would be fully aware of what's happening in Congress. All that information would be available to them. And they would craft a presidential policy proposal after the dust settled and send it down to Congress based upon everything that they've learned. So the two institutions are not separate. They're really still part of the same legislative process.
I have more questions, but I think we're at the point where to give the other people participating in this a chance, they need to get a chance to get some questions in. So Bashan, if you want to chime in, that's fine.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Edsel. As you just said, we are going to take some of the questions from the crowd who's been more than willing to submit. First, we can just start right from the beginning with, do either of you have your own definitions of populism? How would you define populism?
You take this one, Terry.
All right. That's an interesting question, right? Because in everyday language, at least until very recently, populism was a term that was used in reference to standing up for the little guy, right? Being in favor of taxing the rich, being in favor of doing something about poverty and wages and so on, right? And many Democrats were regarded as populists for that reason. But really, there's a lot more to populism than that. And the populist leaders in Latin America and in Europe and in the United States have really been spokesmen for what they consider to be the people against a corrupt system that they intend to attack and triumph over. And these populist leaders have engaged in all of the tactics that I mentioned earlier, appeals to racism, demonization of the other, attacks on democratic institutions, attacks on the media, threats to put their opponents in jail, right? Do all these sound familiar, right? Because these are the exact same things that Donald Trump does. But if you look around the world, other populist leaders do the same thing, right? There's a basic playbook that these populists follow. And it makes sense when you think about it, because if what they're doing is basing their political movement on anger with the system. And if they've risen to power within a democratic system, the system that they're attacking is a democratic system. The institutions are democratic. And so populism has within it this inherent logic that drives its leaders to attack democracy, right? So populism is not just standing up for the little guy. Populism is dangerous. It's dangerous here and it's dangerous all around the world.
That's good. So the next question would be, can you give some examples of what would scaling back the presidential power mean? Are we talking executive orders or something else of that nature?
We talk about a number of them. We've already mentioned some, like reducing the number of political appointments that the president can make. I want to underscore another one, which, Tom, you had raised this concern that kind of we're not doing enough to kind of empower Congress. And let me give a specific example where I think we do provide as much, and that has to do with emergency powers. So under the 1976 Emergency Act, presidents unilaterally can come out and declare the existence of a national emergency and thereby lay claim to all kinds of powers that wouldn't otherwise be available to him, again, someday her. So there it is. And this is exactly what Trump has done in order to then reallocate funds for purposes that Congress had decided would go towards some objectives in the aftermath of his total failure to get Congress to support the building of a wall, right? So he declares this emergency and that allows him to take some money and reallocate it. And Congress, in no small part for some of the reasons that Terry lays out earlier, because of the partisan divisions within it and the partisan allegiances that then keep Congress from stepping forward and checking independently presidential power, doesn't do anything. And having claimed the power, the absence of congressional action is functionally equivalent to support. A thing that we call for is an amendment to the National Emergency Act that says, all right, President, you can declare a national emergency, but then you have to get majorities in both chambers within a certain period of time to get behind it and say, yes, this is an actual national emergency. And if you fail to get that vote, whatever powers you lay claim to automatically lapse. And we could think about regular intervals in which 6 months later, a year later, if you still fail to get them to vote again and to reauthorize those powers that accompany a particular claim about the existence of an emergency, they too, again, will lapse. And so what we're doing here is sort of forcing the hand of legislators to pass judgment and to lay claim, and that if they fail in this instance, if presidents fail to convince legislators that in fact a national emergency doesn't exist, that then whatever powers that they laid claim to promptly lapse. And so that very much has to do with empowering Congress and making life more difficult for the president in a domain of unilateral action that is really problematic.
Okay. How's this one? Wouldn't eliminating the Electoral College and revoking Citizens United significantly alleviate the current gridlock, paralysis, and pork barreling?
No, it wouldn't. You know, I mean, it would be great if the Supreme Court would overturn Citizens United, but then they just enacted Citizens United, so and they're more conservative now than they were back then. So I think that's unlikely. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have a polarized political system because of Citizens United. I think it makes it worse, but we were polarized before then. And we don't have a pork barrel system because of Citizens United. We have a lot of pork barrel politics going on because we have a Congress of 535 people from states and districts who all want a VA hospital back home, you know, and they want to get reelected, and that's the kind of politics they like, right? And they're not thinking about what's best for the nation. They're thinking about what's best for them as political entrepreneurs, and all of this, I should say, and you know, William and I wrote an earlier book called Relic. That's about how the basic structure of our government goes back to the Constitution, and the basic problems that prevent effective government go back to the Constitution. You know, and so remember, the Constitution was designed for a nation of 4 million people, almost all of them farmers. And they designed a government that wasn't expected to do much and couldn't do much because of all the checks and balances and veto points. And because they designed a Congress that had 2 houses and people were elected from all over the country in districts and states. And so maybe that was fine for 1789 when it went into effect. It's not fine now. It's the system that doesn't work very well. And so we can't just think, wow, you know, this is all because of Citizens United or something that happened recently. These are serious built-in structural problems that go way back to the beginning. And I think Americans are going to have to face up to the fact that we have an antiquated system of government that needs to be modified and streamlined so that it can deal with the problems of modern times. The government that we have now can't do that.
And I think you gentlemen may have touched on this a little bit already, but by enabling the president to submit legislation in the way you're proposing, do either of you think this would ultimately undercut the importance of Congress? So would Congress simply be just like a rubber stamp committee?
I think Congress has done a pretty remarkable job of undercutting itself. And so arguments that you'd make on behalf of Congress is to say that, right, it is the branch of government that fosters deliberation and allows for a diversity of views to be articulated in grappling with hard problems. And anybody who turns on C-SPAN and watches what that debate looks like, right, can be privy to a little bit of grandstanding and a whole lot of inaction. And so I think what we're trying to do is sort of put a kind of jumpstart some deliberation within Congress to say, no, it won't do for you simply not to take action or to take a position on some hard issues. And it won't do for you to take a proposal that attends to kind of, or tries to deal with a complex phenomenon in a systematic way and just water it down and break it apart so that it's palatable to organize interest back home. And that we end up with is sort of this unholy mess that you've got to take a position, you've got to vote. And by forcing legislators to take a position and take a vote, the hope is that then we'll actually see meaningful hearings, we'll actually see meaningful deliberation, we'll actually see legislators engaging the legislative process in ways that right now they simply are not. The idea that we can get comprehensive reform to address issues that have been around for decades, having to do with climate change and immigration policy and tax reform and on and on, they've failed to do in a way that is attentive to the problems themselves, in a way that isn't just kind of a lot of money spent with a big name attached to it and all kinds of special carve-outs and exceptions for every organized interest, but that it tries in a cogent, coherent way to attend to the problems at hand. Well, we're not seeing that from Congress. So how might we then not empower the president for the sake of empowering the president, but leverage the president in order to enliven the legislative process so that we have a more effective government? That's what we're trying to do. That's the hope of this particular institutional reform. And it's what we've seen when we've given enhanced agenda setting power to the presidents over time. We referenced earlier fast track authority. The same thing is true with regards to the federal budget, where in the 1921 Budget Act was a recognition on the part of legislators a century ago that they were ill-equipped to sort of put together a budget that would be coherent, that would make sense. And so they turned to the president to say, help us get started. In order for the appropriations process to start, we're going to turn to you to introduce a proposal. We're kind of leveraging these things that have been done in the past in order to allow for meaningful action to follow, not to just empower the president for the sake of empowering the president, but to leverage that which the president stands to offer in the service of a more effective government.
Okay. We're gonna have a more current events question here. Despite President Trump's characterization of Vice President Biden as a radical leftist, I think it might be a little more fair to say he's more of a traditional globalist, if you would. So if, assuming either President Trump gets reelected or if Joe Biden does happen to win the election, what effect do either of you think that that would have on the current populist fervor within America?
Well, you know, we talk about that in the book. I think if Trump wins re-election, this nation is in very serious trouble. I think he clearly has authoritarian inclinations. The Republicans are enabling him. They're not constraining him. He has already seriously undermined our democracy, and he will be even more unleashed. I think our democracy might not survive another 4 years of Trump, and that's serious. If Biden wins, I think the Democrats have a chance, if they win the House and the Senate, to create essentially another progressive movement where they design programs that are directed at people who are hurting and people who are culturally anxious, right? Enacting, say, comprehensive immigration reform. And the Democrats can also design institutional reforms that are intended to give us a government for modern times. That's what the progressives did 100 years ago. That's what the progressive era is known for. They took a system that was mired in corruption and Congress. It was a Congress-led system that couldn't do anything, couldn't get out of its own way. And they gave us a presidentially led administrative state, which is what our government needed in order to handle modernity, except that society just kept modernizing, right? And so what we needed was continuous updating, which we didn't get except for the New Deal. And so here we are almost 100 years later after the New Deal, and we need an update. We need a streamlining. And the Democrats need to do that if they're going to give us an effective government. And I'm afraid, and William is afraid, this is the theme of the book, that if they don't do that, that the populist threat will not be diffused. Our government will remain ineffective, and the populists could come back to power, and our democracy could still go down. This is the Democrats' chance to give us a government that works and that can meet the needs of its people. If we have a government that can't meet the needs of its people, democracy can go down.
Okay. We are reaching toward almost, well, about at the end of the time we have. Before we do go, I wanted to ask each of you, is there a book that you're all, excuse me, currently reading or looking forward to picking up and read next?
I can give mine.
Give yours, Terry.
Okay, so I just finished a book titled Unholy by Sarah Posner, which I think is just fantastic. It's about the rise and history of evangelical Christians and how they became an integral part of the Republican Party. It's really extremely well done. And the other, which I'm just beginning to read, but you know, it's beautifully written and a great history and great read, is Julian Zelizer's book, Burning Down the House, which is about Newt Gingrich, who is really the father of the modern Republican Party, in the sense that this is the party that has become a hothouse of populism and anti-democratic sentiment. I think he is hugely responsible for that, and Trump has taken the baton and magnified these tendencies many times. And I think the result is that the traditional Republican Party has essentially been destroyed, and it's one of the great tragedies of our modern political system.
I'm reading a huge new biography of John F. Kennedy. It's 2 volumes, and the first volume is over 600 pages, and I'm only about 50 pages in. But as a Massachusetts resident, I am intrigued by all the Boston detail and the struggles of an Irish family and what was back in the day when Kennedy was born, a much tougher place to be Irish in.
I'm finishing up Anne Applebaum's Twilight of Democracy, which is, well, it's really a sort of a long essay. And a couple things I appreciate about the book is, one, its recognition that, these threats of democracy and this, what she calls the lure of authoritarianism, is not, it's a global phenomenon. And she also underscores that these divisions and the reckoning that is presented to conservative parties generally is something which is global in nature as well. That what we're observing within the Republican Party and the takeover of populists with authoritarian leanings is not unique to this country. And that too, if we circle that back to the book that Terry and I have just written, we're trying to leverage those lessons from what's happened abroad, both to situate Trump as a phenomenon within something larger, and then also to see how we productively move forward. And for us, that has to do with institutional reform in the service of an effective government. That's not what Anne Applebaum is talking about, that last piece, but that's where we go with it. So there we are.
Understood. Well, just a quick reminder for everyone still here, there is a link in the chat where you can go right to the Politics Pro website to purchase President's Populism and the Crisis of Democracy. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I want to thank the authors, Mr. Moe and Mr. Howell, and also Mr. Edsel for participating. And hopefully everyone will have a good evening and stay safe during these interesting times.
Thanks very much. This was
Yeah,
delightful.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Mhm.